Okay, let's dive right in. If you had to describe, running your household right now, the cost of it, what's the first word that hits you? I bet for a lot of people, maybe for you listening, it's expensive. I mean, ask most Americans if things like groceries, rent, healthcare, the utility bills, if those have gone up significantly in the last, say, decade, you probably get a pretty strong, maybe even frustrated yes.
Absolutely. That's the overwhelming public perception.
Right. But then you look at the official numbers, the government stats, specifically the big one, the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, and the story there often seems, well, much calmer. Outside of major crises, you often see inflation reported around, a manageable 2 or 3%, especially before the recent post-pandemic spike.
That's the target change they often aim for, yes.
So here's the puzzle. Why does the reality in your wallet, the feeling of prices going up, feel so much heavier, so much more inflationary than the numbers in the official reports? This gap, it turns out, it's not really an accident. It's statistical.
It's methodological.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Our deep dive today is into something called hedonic illusions. It's a specific kind of quiet statistical technique, and it systematically shapes the economic picture that gets reported to all of us. We're exploring the argument, the critique really, that this method actually makes it harder for people to understand how their money is losing value.
Right, the erosion of purchasing power.
And that it maybe enables this massive quiet shift of wealth, basically by changing the definition of what inflation is even supposed to measure.
And that redefinition, that's really the critical starting point for you to grasp this. For most people, for the public, inflation is pretty simple, right? It means monetary depreciation, higher prices for the same stuff, your dollar buys less. But the government, through the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, they've adopted a different philosophical measure, you could say. They define inflation as the changing cost of achieving a fixed level of utility.
Okay, hold on. The cost of achieving a fixed level of utility, not price paid, but utility gained.
Exactly. Utility, satisfaction, capability.
That distinction, utility versus the actual dollars you hand over, that seems to be the key to this whole statistical black box we're trying to open up today.
It is. When you shift the focus from the sticker price, the number on the tag, to the price of the satisfaction or the capability that thing provides, well, that's where quality adjustments come in. And that is the key technical culprit, if you want to call it that. Hedonic quality adjustments.
Hedonic, like pleasure or satisfaction?
From the Greek hedon, yes. Pleasure, utility.
So the idea behind these adjustments, it sounds simple on the surface, maybe deceptively so.
It can seem that way.
If a product costs more, let's say a laptop, but it's supposedly improved, faster chip, better screen, whatever.
Or a car with new safety features, a phone with a fancier camera.
Right. The BLS might look at that and say, well, the consumer's getting so much more utility now
that the price increase isn't really inflation.
So they can statistically cancel out some, or maybe even all, of the price hike.
Or even, in some cases, record the price as unchanged, or, believe it or not, lower for the purposes of calculating the CPI.
Wow. Okay, so you pay more cash out of your pocket, but the official inflation number might go down. That's the core of what we need to understand.
That's the hedonic effect. We need to get inside that process.
We really do. Because we're measuring the gap between the sticker price you actually pay at the store and this statistical price.
And that statistical price is the one that dictates how your Social Security checks increase, how tax brackets shift, and maybe even how the Federal Reserve sets interest rates that affect your mortgage or savings. It's hugely consequential.
Right. So to really get the scale of these hedonic adjustments, we need a bit of grounding first. Let's talk basics. What is inflation measurement supposed to do? At its core, inflation is just the rate the general price level goes up, which means your money buys less over time. Purchasing power goes down.
And they measure it by tracking a sort of shopping cart, a basket of goods and services. A weighted basket designed to mirror what a typical household spends money on. Everything from, eggs and milk to rent, electricity, maybe gasoline, new clothes, doctor visit.
And the weighting is important. How much weight do they give to housing versus, say, movie tickets? That must be complicated.
It is, and it's a source of endless debate. How do you accurately capture what the average person buys? And how important each item is in their budget?
Because small changes in that basket or how it's weighted or how you measure the price changes, that could make a big difference in the final number.
A huge difference. And this is what's really fascinating and, frankly, critical to understand. These aren't just numbers for economists to argue about in journals. These CPI numbers are the very scaffolding for enormous parts of our economy and our financial lives. The methodology choices have massive real-world consequences.
Okay, like what? Where does the CPI number actually hit people?
Well, think about the big impact zones. Tiny shifts in how CPI is calculated directly influence. First, Social Security COAs, those cost of living adjustments. The annual increase in benefits for millions of retirees is directly tied to a specific CPI measure, the CPIW.
CPIW, that's for urban wage earners and clerical workers.
Correct. So if that index is consistently understated, even by a little bit, millions of seniors are systematically getting less than they might actually need to keep up with their real costs.
Okay, that's huge. What else?
Second, Federal Reserve policy. The Fed looks closely at inflation readings. They tend to prefer a related measure called the PCE, but CPI is still very important when deciding where to set interest rates.
So if the official inflation data looks artificially low,
the Fed might be inclined to keep interest rates lower for longer than the true economic conditions might warrant. That affects borrowing costs, savings rates, everything.
Right, and things like contracts, taxes.
Yes. Third, contracts and taxation. Many private union contracts and even individual employment agreements index wage increases to the CPI. Plus, U.S. tax brackets, the income levels for different tax rates, are adjusted for inflation based on CPI. Same for eligibility thresholds for many government assistance programs.
So let me connect the dots here. If the BLS methodology consistently shaves off, let's say, just 0.5% from the actual inflation rate,
which some critics argue is easily happening,
then it doesn't just look good politically, like inflation's under control. It means the government literally saves billions. Billions on Social Security payouts, billions potentially on lower interest payments on the national debt.
Exactly. And employers save on wage increases linked to that index.
Wow. Okay.
And that brings us to the compounding effect. This is where the long-term impact on you, the listener, really becomes clear. Even a seemingly tiny, sustained understatement of inflation, let's stick with that hypothetical 0.5% per year, which might be a conservative estimate of the total bias from quality adjustments and things like substitution bias. It compounds relentlessly over time, like reverse interest working against you. Over just 1 decade, that 0.5% difference means the official price level is reported as 5% lower than what people might actually be experiencing.
5% might not sound huge, but over time.
Exactly. Think about a young person starting their career. Over a 40-year working life, that consistent understatement profoundly changes their ability to save for retirement, to build wealth. It acts like a hidden structural tax. It quietly eats away at purchasing power, especially hitting people on fixed incomes retirees again, and wage earners whose raises are tied to this potentially flawed number. It's a slow, quiet erosion of capital.
It's important context, though, that CPI isn't the only inflation measure the government uses, right? You mentioned the Fed prefers something else.
The most common headline number we hear about is CPIU. That's for all urban consumers. CPIW is the one used for Social Security, as we said. But the Federal Reserve often emphasizes the PCE price index personal consumption expenditures. It covers slightly different things, uses different weighting based on actual spending data, not just surveys, and it handles substitutions differently.
And it usually shows slightly lower inflation than CPI.
Often, yes, slightly lower. But the CPI remains the legal benchmark for most benefits and many contracts. So the choices made at the BLS about how CPI is calculated remain incredibly impactful and, frankly, politically charged.
Okay, so the stakes are clearly massive. Billions, trillions of dollars, people's retirement security. It all hinges on getting this number right. Now let's get into the history. How did we end up with this controversial hedonic adjustment method in the first place? So this whole idea of hedonic adjustments, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It actually started, apparently, with economists trying to solve a real statistical puzzle.
That's right. It became especially tricky with the rise of technology. Think about it. How do you accurately compare the price of something that's constantly changing, constantly improving?
Right, like the example of a car from, say, 1975 versus a car today.
Exactly. The 1975 car maybe had manual windows, an AM radio, no airbags, basic brakes. Today's car has power everything. Advanced safety systems, navigation, backup cameras, maybe even some self-driving features.
Okay.
If you just compare the sticker price of a mid-range car then versus now, the price today is obviously way higher. But if you call all of that increase inflation, you're ignoring the huge amount of added value, the features, the capability, the safety the consumer is getting.
So just comparing sticker prices would overstate inflation in that case, because you're not accounting for the fact that you're buying a much better, safer, more capable product.
Precisely. That was the argument. You'd be comparing apples to, well, not quite spaceships, but definitely much more advanced apples.
So the goal became trying to isolate the pure price increase, the part that's just due to money losing value, monetary dilution, and separate that from the value of the quality improvements.
They needed a way to somehow strip out the value of those improvements to get a clearer picture of pure price change.
And that's where Hedonic comes back in, measuring the value of the features.
Exactly. Remember, hedon, pleasure, or utility. Hedonic models are statistical tools that try to mathematically estimate a specific dollar value for different product attributes. Things like horsepower in a car, gigabytes of RAM in a computer, screen resolution on a TV, maybe even safety ratings.
So they try to figure out how much extra people are implicitly paying for that extra horsepower or that bigger screen.
That's the idea. Once the model assigns a dollar value to that attribute, that value can be statistically subtracted from the overall price change when calculating inflation.
Okay, so the concept makes some logical sense, at least for rapidly changing goods. But you said this only really got baked into the official CPI relatively recently. When did that happen?
Well, the theory was around for a while, but the widespread systematic implementation in the official US CPI didn't really take hold until the late 1990s. Two big things converged in the 90s. First, technology was accelerating like crazy. Moore's law was in full swing. Computers, electronics, the old ways of comparing prices just weren't working well anymore. The products were changing too fast. The second thing was political. A very influential report called the Boskin Commission report came out in the mid-1990s.
The Boskin Commission. Okay, what did they find?
This commission, led by economist Michael Boskin, concluded that the official CPI, as it was measured back then, was significantly overstating inflation.
Overstating. By how much?
By about 1.1 percentage points every year. That's a huge number in economic terms.
Why do they think it was overstated?
They pointed to three main reasons. First, they argued the BLS wasn't doing a good enough job accounting for quality improvements. That was the big push for hedonics. Second, they cited substitution bias, the idea that when the price of, say, beef goes up, consumers switch to cheaper chicken, but the index didn't capture that shift quickly enough. And third, they said new products and new retail outlets, like big box stores with lower prices, weren't being added into the index fast enough.
So the Boston Commission basically said the official inflation number is too high, and it's costing the government money and maybe hurting the economy.
Pretty much. If inflation is overstated, then Social Security CLAs are too generous, government debt payments are higher than they need to be in real terms, and it might pressure the Fed to keep policy too tight.
And that report gave the political cover or the impetus to really push for these new methods like hedonics.
It provided the critical political and statistical justification. The argument was, we need to fix the index to get a more accurate picture, which, coincidentally or not, would also save the government billions.
So around 1998, 1999, the BLS started systematically rolling out hedonic adjustments, especially for those fast-changing goods like computers, electronics, cars.
Yes. And importantly, the goal of the index officially shifted. It moved away from just tracking the price of a fixed basket of goods
towards measuring the price of achieving a constant level of utility.
Exactly. That philosophical pivot is absolutely crucial. The BLS is now effectively trying to measure a hypothetical. What would today's car cost if it only had the quality and features of a car from 20 years ago?
But you can't buy that car anymore.
You generally can't, and that's the rub. By adopting this constant utility standard, the number they report, the official CPI, inherently starts to diverge from the actual cash people are paying in the real marketplace. They're measuring what the price should be, in theory, based on constant quality, not necessarily what the price is on the sticker. Okay, so let's try to peek inside the statistical black box. How does this hedonic adjustment actually work in practice? The main tool is a statistical technique called hedonic regression. It's a pretty complex modeling process.
Regression, like finding relationships in data.
Exactly. It tries to take the price of a product and mathematically break it down into two separate parts, two buckets. One bucket is the price change attributed purely to changes in the product's quality or features. The other bucket is the leftover price change, which is considered the pure inflation or deflation.
So they gather a ton of data on, say, different TV models sold, their prices, screen sizes, resolutions, refresh rates, smart features, all that stuff.
Right. They collect vast amounts of data on prices and features for many different models within a product category.
And then the regression model tries to figure out how much the market values each specific feature. Like how much extra are people paying for 4K resolution versus 1080p, holding other things constant.
That's the goal. It's highly inferential. They use the market data, the actual prices people paid for models with different combinations of features, to estimate the implicit dollar value contribution of each feature.
Okay, can you simplify how that model might look conceptually?
Conceptually, you can imagine the price of, say, a new phone being equal to some baseline price. Statisticians call this the intercept, or edible lira, plus a certain dollar amount for its processor speed, plus another amount for its storage capacity, plus another for camera quality, and so on for all the key features.
Like an equation. Price, base plus value speed, plus value storage, plus value camera.
Precisely. In statistical terms, it often looks like price equals to beta $1 plus beta processor speed plus beta 2 storage capacity plus beta 3.3 camera resolution plus beta, and so on. Each of those beta coefficients, beta 2 to beta 3.3, represents the dollar value the statistical model assigns to one unit of that feature, like 1 gigahertz of speed or 1 megapixel of resolution.
And the higher that beta value for a feature is, the more quality the BLS can subtract if that feature improves.
That's exactly right. The model quantifies the value of the improvement, and that quantified value gets deducted from the raw price increase before it goes into the CPI calculation.
Okay, but wait. How do they decide which features to include in the model? And what about features that are hard to quantify? Like, is the software easier to use? Is the design nicer? Is it more energy efficient in a way that's not just raw specs?
You've hit on the really tricky part. The technical Achilles heel, you might say. The model is only as good as the data you feed it and the assumptions you make. And yes, deciding which features matter and how to measure them involves judgment calls by the statisticians.
So it's not purely objective math.
Well, the regression itself is math, but choosing the variables and interpreting the results, especially for subjective or intangible qualities, requires significant expertise and, inevitably, some judgment. How do you put a precise dollar value on a better user experience or increase synergy between components?
Yeah, I can see how that gets fuzzy fast.
Yeah.
And potentially controversial.
It can be. If the data on a particular feature is sparse, or the feature itself is subjective, the estimated value, the beta coefficient, can become quite speculative. The statisticians have to make these crucial, sometimes complex decisions about the imputed dollar worth of an improvement.
And this leads us back to that smartphone example, the smartphone illusion, which really seems to highlight the disconnect.
Let's walk through that again, maybe with slightly different numbers just to illustrate. Say a flagship phone cost $800 last year. This year, the new model is $950.
Okay, so that's a $150 increase in the actual cash you have to pay.
Yeah. Real
money out of your pocket.
Right. But the new phone has, let's say, a significantly better camera system. Maybe it jumps from 64 GB to 128 GB of base storage. And it has a newer, faster, more efficient processor chip.
All sounds like improvements.
So the BLS runs its hedonic regression model. The model might estimate that the better camera system is statistically worth $60. It might value the doubled storage at $75. And maybe the efficiency gains and speed from the new chip are valued at $40.
Okay, so $60 plus $75 plus $40. That adds up to $175 worth of quality improvement, according to the model.
Correct. Now, here's the crucial step for the CPI calculation. They take the actual price increase, $150, and they subtract the imputed quality gain, $175.
So $150 minus $175, yeah. That's negative $25.
Exactly. The adjusted price change that gets recorded in the official CPI data for that phone isn't a $150 increase, it's a $25 price drop.
That's just wild. I pay $150, but the government statistics say the price effectively went down. How is that justified?
The justification from the BLS perspective goes back to that constant utility idea. They argue that even though you paid $150 more, you received $175 worth of additional utility or features. Therefore, the cost of obtaining the same level of utility as last year has actually decreased by $25. You're getting more bang for your buck, statistically speaking.
Even if my bank account is definitely lower.
Even if your bank account is lower, they'd argue that to get this year's level of features last year, you would have had to pay even more than $950, hypothetically.
But the big if, the critique, is that I didn't have a choice. Right? I couldn't buy last year's $800 model anymore. I had to buy the $950 one to get a new flagship phone.
That's a central criticism. The adjustment assumes you value those features at the model's imputed price, and often ignored the lack of consumer choice in the market.
Let's take another example. Cars. They're adjusted heavily too, right?
Very much so. Say a car manufacturer adds $2,500 to the sticker price of a popular SUV model this year.
Okay.
But the new model now includes advanced driver assistance systems, ADS, like lane keeping assist, maybe improved side impact protection to meet new standards, and a slightly more fuel-efficient engine.
Features that cost the manufacturer money to add, presumably.
Yes. So the BLS model might assign, say, $1,000 of value to the ADS features, maybe $800 for the enhanced safety structure, and $500 for the improved fuel efficiency.
Add those up. $1,000 plus $800 plus $500 in imputed quality gain.
Right. So the inflation recorded for that SUV isn't the full $2,500 price hike. It's $2,500 minus the $2,300 adjustment.
Only $200 gets counted as inflation.
Correct. A mere $200 price increase makes it into the CPI calculation, even though the buyer wrote a check for $2,500 more than last year's model. That's a huge reduction in the reported inflation for that vehicle.
So the fundamental assumption underlying all this is that every single added feature is valued by the consumer exactly at the dollar amount the statistical model assigns it.
And desired by them, yes.
Whether you actually wanted that fancy driver assist system or needed it or will even use it, it doesn't matter. For CPI purposes, you got more utilities, so the price didn't really go up as much.
That's the core assumption. Your statistical utility basket is being filled more cheaply, even if your actual cash expenditure is higher. It's a very specific and arguably detached way of measuring price changes.
Okay, so this isn't just statistical gymnastics. This technical adjustment subtracting hypothetical utility from real cash prices, this has real, tangible financial consequences for pretty much everyone.
Absolutely profound consequences. The most immediate one is this growing, systematic gap between the inflation people feel in their daily lives and the inflation rate that gets officially reported.
The lived experience versus the spreadsheet number.
Exactly. And the divergence isn't trivial. You know, the consumer feels the sticker shock when buying a car or electronics or paying a medical bill. But the official record, the number that influences policy, is often engineered through these adjustments to show much more stability or even deflation in some of these major categories.
You mentioned healthcare. How does hedonics play out there? That seems like a place where quality is really complex.
It's hugely complex, and the adjustments can be significant. Think about medical treatments. If a new surgical procedure costs more but leads to a faster recovery time, or a new drug costs more but extends survival rates for a certain condition.
Those are quality improvements, arguably.
Yes, and the CPI methodology treats those improvements better outcomes, shorter hospital stays essentially as discounts. So a hospital bill might jump by, say, 15%. But if the BLS statistical model determines that the new treatment protocol used is hypothetically 10% more effective based on some outcome metric,
then the recorded inflation might only be 5%.
Precisely. The patient or their insurer still has to pay the much higher bill. But statistically, the cost of achieving a certain unit of health outcome is deemed to have risen more modestly. It masks the raw cost increase.
And electronics, you mentioned earlier, can even show price declines.
Routinely. Because technology improves so rapidly according to measurable specs, processor speed, storage, resolution, the hedonic adjustments in categories like computer equipment or telephone hardware are often so large that they result in the CPI reporting sustained price declines, sometimes 10% or more year after year.
Even while the actual price tag on the latest gadget keeps going up.
Even then, and this is critical, When major categories like electronics are showing deflation in the index due to these adjustments, it pulls the overall CPI number down, potentially masking broader inflationary pressures in other areas like food, energy, or services where hedonics are less applicable or harder to measure.
So if economists who critique this estimate that these adjustments, combined with substitution effects, are shaving off somewhere between, say, 0.3 to maybe 0.8 percentage points from the inflation rate each year.
And that's a commonly cited range in critical analyses.
Then this isn't just a measurement issue. It becomes effectively an invisible structural redistribution of wealth.
That's the core argument of the critique, yes. Systematic transfer enabled by a statistical methodology.
Let's break that down. If inflation is consistently understated by the official numbers, who benefits? Who are the winners in this system?
Well, the primary winners are typically large structural debtors, and the biggest debtor of all is
the federal government.
Exactly. By reporting lower CPI figures, the government directly saves potentially billions of dollars each year on those legally mandated Social Security SOLAs. It also means the interest payments on its massive national debt might be lower than they otherwise would be if tied to a higher inflation rate. And there's a more subtle benefit. If actual inflation is running hotter than reported inflation, the real value of that outstanding government debt gets eroded away faster. Inflation becomes a stealth way to reduce the debt burden paid for by holders of that debt, including savers.
Okay, so the government is a major beneficiary. Who else?
Large financial institutions and big corporate borrowers can also benefit. Why? Because understated inflation tends to put downward pressure on the Federal Reserve to keep benchmark interest rates lower than they might otherwise be.
Which makes borrowing cheaper.
It subsidizes borrowing and encourages debt accumulation throughout the financial system. Bondholders might also benefit initially if inflation is understated, as their real returns appear higher.
All right, so if those are the winners, who are the losers? It sounds like ordinary people.
Primarily, yes. The losers tend to be retirees, anyone on a fixed income, wage earners, and savers.
Retirees because their Social Security checks don't keep up with their actual rising costs.
Precisely. They receive CLAs based on the potentially understated CPIW, which might not reflect the true inflation they face, especially for healthcare and housing, which are huge parts of seniors' budget.
And wage earners.
Because many labor contracts index pay raises to the official CPI. If that number is artificially low, wages consistently fail to keep pace with the real erosion of purchasing power. Your paycheck doesn't stretch as far each year.
And savers, people trying to build wealth.
Savers lose because the interest rates offered by banks on savings accounts or CDs are often influenced by the official inflation rate and Fed policy. If official inflation is understated, nominal interest rates might be kept below the true rate of inflation, meaning your savings are actually losing purchasing power over time, even while earning interest. It guarantees a loss in real terms.
Let's revisit that Social Security CLA example again, because the scale of it is important.
It really drives home the impact. If CPI is understated by just that 0.5%, 0.5% consistently each year, think about a retiree getting, say, $2,000 a month today. Over a typical 25-year retirement period, the cumulative loss in benefits due to that small annual understatement could exceed $25,000.
$25,000. That's not pocket change. For many retirees, that's a huge amount of money.
It's absolutely huge. That $25,000 could be the difference between affording needed medication or visiting grandkids or paying for essential home repairs or needing long-term care.
It's a hidden transfer, taking away choices and security, driven by a statistical adjustment.
That's the argument. It's a structural transfer of resources and life choices, masked by the complexity of the official numbers.
And politically, this all makes it easier to keep spending or printing money, right? Because the official numbers don't flash red as quickly.
That's a major hidden consequence, critics argue. When the official statistics are engineered to downplay price increases, it provides a sort of political shield. It dampens public outcry about the cost of living, reducing pressure on politicians to control government spending or on the central bank to tighten monetary policy. Monetary expansion becomes politically less painful, at least in the short term, according to the official stats. So this consistent gap between the official numbers and lived experience and the policy consequences we've discussed, it brings us to a more fundamental philosophical criticism. This often comes from economists in the what's known as the Austrian tradition of economics.
Okay, what's their core argument here?
Their argument is that inflation, at its heart, is fundamentally a monetary phenomenon. It's about the value of money itself declining.
Meaning, it's primarily about too much money chasing too few goods, causing the purchasing power of each dollar to fall, rather than being about the features on a smartphone.
Precisely. From this perspective, quality improvements, a better camera, a safer car are great. They represent technological progress, but they don't negate the effects of monetary dilution. If the overall money supply expands significantly, leading prices generally to rise, the fact that your new laptop is faster doesn't change the underlying reality that your dollar buys less than it used to.
So, even if the BLS model says the utility per dollar has gone up for that laptop,
the Austrian critique would say, that's irrelevant to the question of monetary inflation. If the family has to spend more dollars today to buy that laptop than they did last year, regardless of the improved features, that is inflation in the sense of their money losing value. The hedonic adjustment obscures this fundamental monetary reality.
it masks the consequence of the monetary expansion itself.
Exactly. It complicates how consumers experience the dilution, but it doesn't eliminate it.
And this ties back to that issue of forced purchases and subjective value.
Yes. The hedonic method assumes consumers fully value the imputed worth of every new feature. But critics argue, what if they don't? What if they're forced to buy the new, more expensive model simply because the older, simpler, constant quality model isn't available anymore?
Like needing a basic refrigerator, but only models with smart screens and Wi-Fi are sold now at a higher price.
Right. You're forced to pay for features you might not want or need just to get the basic utility keeping your food cold. The hedonic adjustment counts that forced upgrade as negating inflation, while the consumer just feels the higher cost.
And then there's this idea of the ratchet effect. How does that work?
The ratchet effect refers to an asymmetry, a bias, in how quality changes are often handled. Quality improvements, faster chips, better materials, more features tend to be diligently measured and factored in, consistently pushing the reported CPI down. But quality declines are statistically much harder to capture and seem to be accounted for less often or less systematically. Think about shrinkflation.
Right. When the package size gets smaller, but the price stays the same, like fewer chips in the bag or a slightly smaller candy bar.
Exactly. Or maybe a manufacturer switches to slightly cheaper materials, making a product less durable than it used to be. Capturing that kind of quality decline and adjusting the CPI upward accordingly is technically difficult and, critics argue, happens much less frequently.
So the adjustments mostly work in one direction downwards, creating a built-in bias over time.
That's the concern. The ratchet clicks down for improvements, but rarely clicks back up for declines, leading to a persistent downward bias in the official index.
Okay, so if the official BLS numbers, influenced heavily by hedonics and substitution, might be systematically understating inflation, what do some of the alternative independent measures show? Measures that deliberately reject these adjustments.
This is where the comparison gets really stark. There are a couple of well-known alternative measures that specifically calculate inflation using older methodologies, essentially ignoring the changes implemented since the Boskin Commission era. Probably the most cited is ShadowStats, which is run by economist John Williams.
ShadowStats, what do they do differently?
They basically try to reconstruct the CPI using the official BLS methodology as it existed before the major changes of the 1980s and 90s. So, critically, ShadowStats rejects hedonic quality adjustments altogether. It aims to track the cost of maintaining a constant standard of living, not constant utility.
So raw price changes for the most part.
Largely, yes. It also rejects the geometric weighting used to account for substitution bias, that switching from beef to chicken idea. And maybe most importantly, it uses the older methodology for calculating housing costs.
Housing, that's a huge part of the index. How did they used to measure it?
The older method was based more directly on actual home prices and mortgage interest costs. The current method, used since the early 80s, relies heavily on something called owner's equivalent rent, or OER.
OER. That's where they survey homeowners and ask them how much they think they could rent their own house for.
Exactly. It's an imputed subjective measure, not a direct transaction price. And it tends to be much less volatile and often lower than tracking actual house price inflation, especially during housing booms.
So that difference in measuring housing alone could create a massive gap between ShadowStats and the official CPI.
It's arguably the single biggest driver of the difference, and the result is that ShadowStats consistently shows annual inflation rates that are often 5 to 7 percentage points higher than the official CPI number. Dramatically higher.
5 to 7 points. That's a completely different economic reality. Is there another alternative?
Another interesting one is the Chapwood Index. It takes a different approach again. It tracks the year-over-year price changes for a fixed basket of about 500 specific, commonly purchased goods and services, and it does this across 50 major U.S. cities.
A fixed basket. I mean, they don't change the item?
Exactly. Same 500 items year after year, no hedonic adjustments for quality changes, no substitutions allowed if one item gets expensive. It's designed purely to measure the raw cost increase of maintaining the exact same lifestyle.
So it's aiming directly at that lived experience cost.
That's the idea. And its results. The Chapwood Index frequently reports annual inflation rates in major cities ranging from 8% to as high as 13%.
8 to 13%, when the official CPI might be saying 2 or 3%.
Yes, often 4 or 5 times higher than the official rate.
Wow. So taking these alternatives together, even if you don't assume they are perfectly accurate either, the sheer size of the gap between them and the official CPI seems to really underscore the core argument here.
It absolutely does. It confirms that the official CPI, driven largely by these methodologies like hedonics and substitution, is measuring a very specific theoretical statistical concept, the cost of constant utility, which in practice often diverges dramatically from the cost reality people face at the checkout counter or when paying their rent or mortgage.
This brings us to a bigger point. This whole debate about statistical methods, hedonics, CPI, it's not just about economics, is it? It feels like there are deeper issues at stake related to transparency and maybe even self-government.
I think that's a crucial takeaway. The argument is that when the primary tool for measuring inflation, something as fundamental as the value of money, becomes detached from people's lived reality due to complex, opaque adjustments,
it becomes harder for citizens to hold policymakers accountable.
Exactly. Honest prices, or at least an honest measure of price changes, are like the language of a free market. They convey vital information. If that information signal is distorted, if the real pain of monetary dilution, the loss of purchasing power, is statistically smoothed over or explained away in the official numbers,
it undermines people's ability to make rational decisions, both personally and politically.
It weakens civic oversight. How can voters accurately judge the consequences of government spending policies or central bank actions if the main gauge of inflation doesn't reflect their own experience?
It feels like it could create that political shield we talked about earlier.
It absolutely can. Understated inflation provides cover. It dampens the public's perception of economic hardship, even while their real standard of living might be declining.
Which, in turn, reduces the political pressure on the government to maybe exercise fiscal restraint, or on the central bank to prioritize stabilizing the currency's value.
Monetary expansion, whether through government deficits or central bank actions, becomes politically easier to sustain if the official thermometer doesn't register a high fever. The statistics can project an image of stability, even behind a veil of, let's say, statistical optimism.
And the ultimate danger, according to the critique, is that this statistical methodology ends up facilitating that structural transfer of wealth we discussed.
Yes, away from savers, wage earners, and retirees, and towards the government and potentially the financial sector, all enabled by a number that doesn't fully capture the erosion of money's value.
So given these high stakes, what are some of the proposed solutions? If the current system is flawed, how could trust be restored? How can we bridge this gap between the official stats and reality?
Well, transparency is clearly paramount. One key suggestion you often hear is for the BLS to simply be much more open about the impact of these adjustments. For example, they could publish plain language summaries alongside the official CPI release each month.
Summaries that show what?
That explicitly show the difference, provide side-by-side numbers. Here's the raw, unadjusted price change for this category, and here's the final number after we applied hedonic quality adjustments. Let people see the math.
Just show the size of the adjustment itself. That seems reasonable.
Let the public see exactly how much imputed utility was subtracted from the actual price increases.
I think another powerful idea I've seen floated is creating a completely separate measure. Something designed for the public.
Yes, that's a really important proposal. The creation of a parallel lived experience price index, or LEPI.
LEPI, what would that track?
It would be a government-published index, but designed specifically to be consumer-facing. Crucially, it would be explicitly free of hedonic adjustments, and maybe also free of the more complex substitution adjustments.
So closer to how people actually experience price changes for a relatively fixed basket of goods.
Exactly. It wouldn't necessarily replace the current CPI for all its legal statutory uses. Changing Social Security indexing would require an act of Congress, for instance.
But it would give people an official, honest benchmark.
It would provide the public, policymakers, and the media with an official, easy-to-understand yardstick that likely aligns much more closely with the costs people see for groceries, rent, gas, the things that dominate household budgets. It creates a vital point of comparison.
What about addressing that forced purchase problem, where you have to buy the new expensive model?
That leads to another suggested reform, sometimes called choice sensitivity. The idea here is that hedonic adjustment should only be applied when consumers actually have a choice, meaning they should only subtract quality value if the older, lower quality, lower price model is still available for purchase alongside the new, improved, more expensive model.
Oh, okay. So if you can still buy last year's phone or the base model car without the fancy features,
then maybe it's fair to adjust the price of the fancier model for its added utility because you weren't forced into buying it.
but if the only option on the market is the new, expensive, feature-loaded version,
Then the full price increase should probably be counted as inflation in the index because the consumer had no choice but to pay the higher price to get the basic function, regardless of whether they personally valued all the new bells and whistles at the level the BLS model imputed.
that seems like it would align this statistic much more closely with actual market conditions people face.
It aims to do just that.
So the overall goal here, it sounds like, isn't necessarily to say hedonic analysis is useless. It probably has value for tracking technological progress itself.
Academically, yes, it's interesting to try and quantify quality change.
But the goal is to prevent these statistical techniques from fundamentally redefining reality for policy purposes, to stop them from obscuring the actual cost of living and the effects of monetary policy.
Precisely. We need statistics that accurately reflect the economic reality people face, not statistics that are engineered, intentionally or unintentionally, to perhaps justify certain policies or paint an overly optimistic picture. A trustworthy measure of inflation, of monetary erosion, needs to be both methodologically sound and grounded in the everyday experience of trying to make ends meet.
So wrapping this up, what does all this mean for you listening right now? This whole deep dive into hedonic adjustments, it really boils down to a fundamental debate about truth and honesty in economic measurement. Are we accurately tracking how much the value of your dollar is eroding because of monetary policy and other factors?
Or are we, through layers of statistical complexity and potentially questionable assumptions, effectively hiding some of the true cost of government policy choices, hiding the real inflation tax?
The numbers, the statistics, they always tell a story. They have to simplify reality somehow. But the final question, the one for you to really think about, is this. When you see that official CPI number released each month, whose story is it actually telling? Is it telling the story that's reflected in the BLS spreadsheets, where complex models show many things getting statistically cheaper due to imputed quality gains? Or is it reflecting the story you experience at the grocery store checkout, at the gas pump, when paying your rent or your health insurance bill, the story where the cost of just maintaining your standard of living feels like it's going up, consistently, relentlessly, year after year? Which reality does the number capture? Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to the deep dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shaped liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.